What's up, everybody? I'm David Hain. Welcome to episode 108 of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast. If you would like one-on-one counseling or to launch or join a group using the podcasts or the From Ashes to Destiny curriculum, please send me a message by email at davidfroma2d@gmail.com or go to my website www.froma2d.org and click on the contact page. When we come back, we'll get into this episode entitled Fault Lines. Welcome back to episode 108 of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast entitled Fault Lines. Let's start out today by defining what a fault line is. And I promise not to get too scientific because I'm not really that scientific myself. So a fault line is defined as a long crack in the surface of the earth. And if you look into it, there's actually two plates or surfaces of rock that move in opposite directions in reaction to stress. And how does the rock respond to that stress? Well, the result is this crack or fracture or fault line, and this break that shows up there is the place that when earthquakes come, they usually occur along these fault lines, and that's when the whole area starts shaking. Well, hopefully you have that picture. Today we're going to be looking at that example of natural fault lines in the Earth's surface and comparing them to emotional fault lines or cracks in our heart from past emotional wounds. So areas where it's almost that we've got two different plates or surfaces along this crack that are moving in opposite directions in reaction to stress, and the break occurs and we have an emotional earthquake, so to speak. I'd like to start out to understand this emotional aspect by using the words of Tom Petty's song, Fault Lines. Here's a bit of the lyrics. See those fault lines, laid down like landmines. It's hard to relax. A promise broken, the ground breaks open, love falls through the cracks, and I've got a few of my own. I've got a few of my own fault lines running under my life. Can you identify with those words? Do you begin to see that, like most of us, you've got a few of your own fault lines running under your life? And these fault lines come from sort of previous emotional trauma and earthquakes that we've experienced. So it could have been any of a number of traumatic life events. It could have been relapse after rehab or loss of a job, a divorce or a broken relationship, death in the family, financial crisis, homelessness or incarceration. Lots of things that just cause these fault lines. And I have many people, as I work with them to try to identify these old wounds, they'll say things like, but David, I'm afraid that the healing will hurt worse than the wound. So let's not even go there. And they tend to ignore these old wounds. But the problem with ignoring the old wounds is the tremors still happen, just like the tremors when it's not quite an earthquake yet. And most people ignore the tremors, but scientists keep track of them. And some tremors that happen in our lives and in our emotions are loneliness and sadness and depression and anxiety, cravings, sleeplessness, nightmares, nervousness, outbursts of anger, and on and on. And we really can't ignore those tremors as we come to understand that there could be another earthquake coming. Well, Leah Perrault wrote in the Catholic Register an article entitled Faith Within the Fault Lines of Feelings. And what she said in this, and I quote, she said, "My feelings come in waves, both fleeting and relentless. They find their way to the fault lines of life's previous earthquakes. This is complicated because I spent a lot of years denying feelings that I didn't think were useful or productive. These days I am learning and relearning that all feelings have purpose and all of them are part of faith." Wow. Can you hear the words that Leah Perrault said there? That she spent years denying her feelings, ignoring the tremors, as I said, because she didn't think it was useful or productive to deal with them, but she's now having to learn that all feelings have a purpose. But as we're ignoring them, we sort of are in this state of willful blindness where we're just staying in denial. And Belgian writer and painter Eric Pevernaghi said, "Willful blindness may hinder us from discerning the critical fault lines in the narrative of our life. Our memory may obliterate then the crucial elements that are vital to really come to know ourselves." Can you catch what he's saying there? That when we stay in this willful blindness, this denial, we can't even discern these fault lines in our life. And our memory erases or blots out these elements that are so crucial, so vital to really get to know ourselves. And Mr. Pevernaghi continued by saying, and I quote, "When our mind is in shambles and we dare to reflect on the story of our life, we may discover in the stream of our thoughts the fault line between what we have underfelt and what we have overthought on our way." Sure. Does that describe you? That you've been denying the tremors, denying the fault lines to where you've underfelt emotions that you should have felt, and you've overthought other things that you should have been processing at an emotional level. Can you see how these fault lines can really create ongoing problems? So let me go back to the scientific thing to get some input as to what we do about it. Well, the California Earthquake Authority states steps to survive when an earthquake hits. And they say, first, ahead of time, when the tremors are happening, identify your weaknesses. And so I want to ask you, part of your weaknesses would be, do you live in an earthquake-prone area? Are you living in a community or with family that it's just like a time bomb going off and the tremors are always happening and the earthquake could happen any day? Number two, when the earthquake hits, the first thing you must do is drop to the ground and grab your emergency kit. But I want to ask you, what would you put in your emergency kit? How do you keep it ready? What does your support system look like so that when you drop to the ground, you're not alone? When you feel the earthquake coming, you've got your emergency kit at hand. The next step, the California Earthquake Authority says, is cover. Very specifically, they're saying get under the dining room table or a desk. And so I want to ask you, how can you shelter properly so that other things don't fall on top of you during your emotional earthquake? Because that's why we need cover, that as we're down there trying to withstand this earthquake, we don't get more debris falling on top of our already weakened condition. The fourth step says, hold on. And here, the Earthquake Authority says, stay inside and in place until the shaking stops. Do you hear that? When the earthquake's happening, when the storm is going and the waves are roiling, don't try to be out there in the midst of the earthquake. Stay inside, stay in place, stay still until the emotional shaking stops. And number 5, after the shaking stops, check for damage and see what needs attention. So what do you have as a way to take personal inventory? What tool do you use for an emotional checkup that you can do a self-check? What people do you have that you can bounce things off of after the shaking stops so that they can give their input as the damage that they see that you may be already minimizing or denying because that's just what you've done in the past? I think it's so important to deal with our fault lines and to be able to process them. And I'd like to close with a thought from American journalist John Geddes, who wrote in A Familiar Rain, and I quote, "The heart breaks in so many different ways that when it heals, it will have fault lines." Shaw, do you hear that? Even if you've processed with the heartbreaks, the emotional earthquakes of the past, the remnants are going to be fault lines in your heart, just like scars on the outside when you have a wound. So please, don't ignore the tremors and deal with your fault lines. Thanks for listening to this episode of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast. If you enjoyed hearing about fault lines, please like, subscribe, follow, and share the link with your friends, or click on the support link in this episode's description. Your donation of any amount could change a life. If you would like to share any feedback, please message me on the link in this podcast or by email at davidfromatod@gmail.com, or go to my website www.fromatod.org and click on the contact page. You can also keep in touch with what we're doing in From A to D by following me on Instagram at davidfromatod. Tune in Monday for our next episode, and as always, stay safe and stay strong.